Hello, this is Foster Pupil, Stefan Bertram, and Ben Burgess, who's so back. We are so back. Things are occurring, and we're going to be talking about Karl Marx again.
Yeah, nature is healing.
I was reading, I wasn't reading Marx and Inferno, but I was reading what you wrote about them, and it is, I think, going to be one where we agree a lot, but also I think it'd be quite interesting to talk about kind of like the structure or like the correct way of being exegetical when you do exegesis. Um, in the sense that it feels like Roberts, when he's doing this, would be much better off saying, okay, perhaps Karl Marx didn't think this, but we can think about things in this way and this way, and maybe it would make sense. But because he's doing the work interpreting Marx, he doesn't want to do that. He rather wants to portray Marx as actually thinking such and such.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that it's sort of I think that it's a danger of with any thinker that you very strongly identify with, which obviously for lots of socialists is Marx, because they're very attracted by like any number of insights that you find there. To really want them to think what you think, right? And if you're a smart guy, which William Clare Roberts certainly is, right? To sort of like keep looking at it until you can find a way of convincing
Yeah,
yourself.
I knew bro was cooked when you were talking about him going into like, oh, and this and actually doesn't mean a conjunction of clauses. It means two separate clauses. I was like,
Yeah.
ah, it's over for bro.
Yeah, exactly. Like you just kind of keep peering at it until you can sort of find a way to see the pattern that you want to see. Um, you know, and yeah, I think there's a lot of this going on here. And of course, he's certainly not unique in it. I mean, even on this specific issue about economic growth, right? Of course, there's this Saito, Marx of the Anthropocene and all of that, and which is even my understanding is like Saito is like kind of getting this stuff from Bellamy, but Bellamy, to his credit, doesn't actually say it's all there in Marx,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
Like he just sort of says like, oh, here's this sort of suggestive way you could develop this idea. It sort of goes beyond what Marx actually says. So the sort of context for people who aren't hyper aware of these debates is that there's a point in Capital where Marx is very concerned about soil erosion. Right, he brings this up a few times, which is basically the worry is that capitalist agriculture, like that you have these incentives for short-term profits to use farming techniques that like use up the soil really quickly, right? I mean, that's basically the concern. And when he's talking about soil fertility, he uses this phrase about the metabolic connection,
Mm.
between humans and the land. And this is something that like Bellamy, and then again, I think Saito in a way that's like reading it all into Marx much more than like Bellamy does, sort of picks this up as a general metaphor for thinking about environmental destruction of any kind, which is, I mean, that part is like not totally unreasonable, but but then sort of takes that as the basis for this eco-socialist view that says actually we should really want to like slow down further progress in the forces of production, or maybe even like consciously roll it back. um and this is just like so clearly not at all what Marx thinks. And again, that's fine, right? I mean, there's stuff like there's stuff I think Marx is wrong about, right? Like there's it's like it's fine, you should
Yeah,
treat him
especially when you're introducing him into the context which he wasn't in. Like there
right.
were certainly concerns about environmentalism in the 19th century, but the whole concept of like human-driven climate change is just alien to the kind of discursive environment where Marx is writing.
Right, exactly, right. And it's like again, it's fine. It's a perfectly respectable position to say. I think, hey, Marx thought A, but hey, Marx didn't know about global climate change, right? I think it's understandable that he thought A, but now in the 21st century, I think not A, and here's why, right? And here's the stuff I still think Marx was right about, but here's how to sort of take that stuff and make
Yeah,
sense.
in some sense, it would actually be really weird if Marx secretly agreed with us on climate change despite not knowing anything about it.
Yeah.
Like, why is his kind of perspective, which is not developed within the context of knowing things, actually any good?
Yeah, right. So as I understand the kind of Saito move, it's to say, hey, look at all these unpublished notebooks where we can see Marx, of course, not because of climate change, he didn't know about that, but because of this, concerns about soil fertility and all of that, right? We could see him actually sort of abandoning, historical materialism classic and saying that actually communism is not going to inherit the sort of advanced productive forces built up from capitalism and further expand from there. Actually, it's going to have to get rid of a lot of the technology that was developed under capitalism or whatever. And it's kind of funny. So I should say, because I want to be fair about this, I do, I don't want to too closely associate the Roberts view with the Saito view, because while I do suspect that some sympathy for something at least kind of sort of Saito-esque is driving Roberts to take the position that he does in Marx's Inferno, that's just speculation, right? I mean, there's one line where he's oh, one reason you might think this now is because of concern with anthropogenic climate change, but of course that's not the relevant one in this circumstance, right? So but regardless of why he thinks it, right, he does Roberts also does say I think go as far as he thinks he can justify in the direction of saying that actually Marx doesn't have the sort of techno-optimistic view of socialism that he's generally understood as having in Capital. And the interesting thing about this is that Saito and Roberts sort of get there in opposite ways, because in Saito's case, he's basing this on extremely late unpublished notebooks. So he's saying, oh, look, Marx is changing his mind, right, in these notebooks. And there's a good article about this by Matt Huber and Lee Phillips and Jacobin called I don't remember the full title, but it has the phrase "start from scratch communism" in the title. And one of the things they point out is that it seems like a lot of Saito's evidence, it's he's just kind of taking any passage from a book on soil fertility or whatever that Marx copies down into a notebook as Marx endorsing the views that he's quoting, right? Which is obviously a bad assumption to make, especially in the sort of bygone pre-internet era, where if you wanted to keep track of what everybody was saying, you had to write it down, right? And especially you're learning about a new subject, etc., right? So I think that's very weak evidence, but it's also kind of funny that Roberts sort of does the opposite, because he does, when he's sort of making his case that see Marx and Capital has really backed off with the techno-optimism, he's bracketing all of this evidence from outside of Capital. And so he's okay, sure, and the Grundrisse, Marx says this and that, but really what he says in Capital should be the sort of decisive thing, because that's what
Roberts is doing. There's nothing outside the text. He's I'm just talking about Capital.
Yeah, basically, right. He says in so let's see. He says Marx had at times a proclivity for certain techno-utopian lines of thought, which would see in the industrial capacity for producing absolute abundance the precondition of escaping capitalism. And yet, this is the part that I'm disagreeing with in the essay, Marx does not make anything like these arguments in Capital. And then his sort of justification he gives in the next line for only focusing on capital is the discipline imposed by writing for public consumption and for the sake of influencing the workers' movement compelled him to make deliberate choices about what to include and what to exclude. Those choices were instructive regarding both his considered views and his sense of the discourse into which he was intervening. In other words, like the only thing that counts is the sort of like final draft for something that was getting published, right? Which, to be fair, I think is a better methodology than the Saito one, right? I mean, if we're sort of deciding how much weight to give things, I think that like sure, something of a final draft of something is going to be published like does deserve to be given more weight than than something than like an unpublished notebook that you might do something with someday, right? But
yeah, I mean, and it's also fine to just be like, this is my analysis of Capital. I'm not doing the whole literature in this book,
Yeah, no, sure, for sure, right? But like, I do also think that like he's probably bending the stick a little bit too far in that direction in that passage, because it's like, look, it's one thing to say, don't like assume that he agrees with people he's like quoting and like stuff he writes down in notebooks when he's like learning literature, but like I don't know, I mean, if you write like hundreds of pages of your own analysis in an unpublished manuscript, like that tells you something about your views, right? Like that's that's just that's totally that's not that shouldn't be totally irrelevant as evidence, but whatever. I mean, I think we can put all that aside, because I think the bigger thing is that
the evidence presented is not very good.
Yeah, the analysis of Capital itself is not very good. Like, I'm kind of happy, at least for the sake of argument, to join him in like disregarding everything outside of Capital and just talk about Capital. I mean, whatever. It's what I know best at this point anyway. Like, I'm perfectly happy to focus on it, but like, but I also just think, yeah, what he says about Capital is not convincing to me. Whether or not he's correct that whether or not I'm correct in suspecting that his motivation is like for downplaying the techno optimism in Capital is some level of sympathy for sort of like degrowth eco-socialism. Whether or not that's correct, like, forget what his motivations are for a second. I just think that like the text doesn't support it, right? I mean, and to go back to your original point, like if we do want to be like, I'm perfectly happy to have that argument on its merits, right? I mean, like you can just say, yeah, I think Marx was right about lots of stuff. I think he was wrong about this, right? And here's why I think he was wrong, and and whatever. I mean, like honestly, if you're like a degrowther because of concerns about anthropogenic climate change, as a Marx fan, it shouldn't even be that embarrassing for you, because like Marx has such an excellent excuse for not sharing your concerns about that.
Yeah, it's like this basically like extraneous variable.
Yeah, exactly, right. So now I myself don't think that, right? I mean, what I think is, I mean, this goes beyond what I say in the essay, but I mean, like, what I think is that if it were really true that the only way out of global climate change were to do the sort of thing, I mean, like, I don't know, there's like a book called, I don't know if you know this book, Drew Pendergast and Troy Vattiz have a book called Half Earth Socialism, a plan to save the future from extinction, climate change, and pandemics. That's a really insane book, but I'll sort of, in a perverse kind of way, I'll give them credit for like spelling this out much more clearly than most people with their position do. That they're like, oh, we should actually like do this conscious rewilding of like, half of the Earth's surface, and like we're all, like and like most of us are going to be doing like agriculture now, and also there's going to be universal veganism, and it's like, okay,
Cool.
if the only way to prevent global, to escape from like the global climate crisis were to do that, I'm just going to tell you right now, we're not going to escape the global climate crisis, because that's not going to happen, right? So like,
I mean, it seems to be a world where there is less than 8 billion people on it.
Yeah, I don't understand any version of this math where most of the human race doesn't die in the process, right? So, and
which seems like not a solution.
Yeah, it seems like medicine is worse than the disease. But also, like, again, even if it were better than the disease, like, that's just not going to happen, right? I mean, like you're not gonna convince. You're not going to convince like the human race to collectively go for that, right? I mean, like, I think it's not a coincidence that there are 0 instances in the history of the world of a society voluntarily regressing to like a lower level of development than that it started with. I mean, the only instances of the regressing happening are because of like massive external shocks, right? Like it's people didn't choose to, right? It just happened to them, right? That like like the collapse of the Roman Empire or whatever, stuff like that, right? So I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the sort of, I think that the instinct behind like Green New Deal sorts of approaches to climate change is a much healthier one. That's like, look, if you're gonna get out of this, right, you need to, if you're going to get the majority that you need behind you in your efforts to get out of it, you need to find a way to link it to something that's going to make people's lives better instead of worse, right? Like, which again, I think is possible. I think that we could do like a green energy transition where we actually create lots of jobs in the process. I certainly wouldn't pretend to like have a kind of expertise that I don't about the sort of nitty gritty debates about, whether through like individual technologies. But like the thing that I'm sure of, right, is that if the only way out was to somehow convince everybody to be like abstemious and like accept a worse lifestyle, and part of the process, we're not going to get out, right?
The UK nationalized steel yesterday, and I was surprised when our Green Party was like, "Oh, we need to nationalize this steel and build more steel so we can build windmills and stuff," which is a completely reasonable and correct perspective. Yeah. I was just surprised to hear like a contemporary Green Party saying it.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good sign. Yeah, I mean, I this is also, this is also one, I am like, this is also why I think that it's like crazy for the left not to be pro-nuclear, for example, right? Like, I think that like any sort of avenue of energy production that doesn't contribute to global climate change, right? I think the default stance should be, yes, let's do more of that.
Less than Poland soon.
Yeah,
very little.
Yeah, which is funny, right? So I was thinking of the classic Judas Priest, right? British Steel. Yeah. So,
but on Roberts, just to clarify, when Ben said he disagrees with the analysis of capitalism, you just mean this bit. Generally, you find it very agreeable.
Yeah, exactly, right. So, I actually, I know I tried to front load this at the beginning of the essay, because otherwise I knew it wouldn't come off. But I actually liked the book. I think it's a good book overall. I just thought that this bit of it, and a couple others, but I mean, this is the most important one, was very unconvincing, right? Like, this is so. I think that, the book in general, I mean, there's a whole framing device, which is where the title comes from, about capital sort of structurally mirroring Dante's Inferno, and it's a little bit unclear, at least to me. Maybe I'd have to go back and reread these bits. How much Roberts is claiming that it's like Marx is like doing this intentionally, and how much it's just like, well, whatever. We know he liked Dante, and regardless of what's that.
It's a fun idea if it's true.
Yeah, it's a fun idea for sure.
And if it's wrong, it doesn't matter. So
yeah, I mean, so to the extent that he's claiming that it's like, oh, it's like intentionally mirroring the structure of Dante's Inferno, I don't know, maybe not, but like I also just don't care that much about that one way or the other, right? Like that doesn't seem like the most interesting issue with regards to any of this. But I do actually think, like, especially with the earlier parts of the book, there are things in Marx's Inferno that helped me, understand, what Marx is up to, and some of those early parts of the book. The example I gave in the essay is there's a famous line in chapter 7. I just went over it with the like in-person version of my Capital class in LA, where Marx says that the is like describing capitalists buying labor power from workers, and says, and he makes the point that if the capitalist is buying a full day of labor power, and it only takes half a day for the worker to reproduce their substance, then this is a piece of good luck for the buyer, but by no means an injustice to the seller. And I think a lot of people have been very confused by that line, right? Because it's like, well, wait a second. It's by no means an injustice to the seller. I mean, like, if you read the rest of the book, it certainly feels like Marx thinks that there's some sort of grave injustice going on in capitalist exploitation, right? Like he, 3 chapters later, you get him describing, like comparing the capitalists to vampires and werewolves, with the insatiable lust for extra hours at the end of the working day. He's sort of luridly describing, as child labor and people losing limbs in factories, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
and the first big bit of exploitation he seems to argue for is the thing of like, well, after 4 hours you've done reproducing yourself, and the next 4 hours are free. But in capitalism, that's disguised in a way it wasn't in feudal agricultural labor. But the Roberts thing is to make clear this point, is to like make a subtle distinction here between what's going on.
Yeah, because right. So Marx constantly compares, the sort of extraction of these extra hours of labor after you've, reproduced your sustenance to the feudal corvée, right? Which, he expected all of his readers to see as this sort of intolerable form of unfreedom. He constantly refers to this throughout Capital as unpaid labor. There are a zillion places where he uses words like theft, right? So it's like, what do you mean this is by no means an injustice? And I think a lot of people will sort of read all kinds of things into it. That's like, oh, see, Marx is, Marx has this technical account of exploitation, but he doesn't moralize it. It's not, it's like sometimes the way people talk about this, it's like, oh, it seems like their understanding of what's going on here is that Marx has sort of randomly dipped into moral anti-realism in a way that just seems totally off topic in context, right? Why are we talking about metaethics now? And
like as if injustice is disconnected from the general account of exploitation.
Yeah, exactly.
Just saying it's not injustice because actually it's exploitation.
Yeah, right. So it's like, oh, it's not in. So it's like, yeah, one way of reading this is like, oh, it's not injustice because nothing is an injustice because I don't believe in injustice, which is like, okay, maybe, but it'll be like a really weird thing to pause to note, in that context.
Not explained.
Not explained in any way, right?
Not with a footnote or anything. If there isn't a footnote or explanation, you think it's actually part of the actual argument and not a side thing.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's certainly presented as part of the argument, and I think Roberts is very useful. I mean, I kind of quote what he says about this, but basically in explaining why it is that I think giving a reasonable account of why Marx would have expected his readers to like understand the point he was making in the context of the argument, right? Which is like, look, when he's talking about justice here, he's not, he's not talking about like what Rawls is talking about when he's talking about justice, right? Like what he means by an injustice is a violation of the law of exchange. That you're this. So like the injustice he has in mind here is like the sort of thing that like a Proudhonian mutualist, right, would be concerned with, right? That you're exchanging like for like. And so the point in context is no, you are like exchanging like for like, right? Like this is, and I think that this makes sense in context because, I mean, this is going beyond what Robert says. This is me saying it, but like, this is what I would get out of his point, right? Like in Capital, sure, Marx is responding on the one hand to bourgeois apologists who say, hey, how can capitalism possibly be a system of domination and exploitation? Because look, it's all based on sort of free and voluntary exchanges, in the market. And so Marx wants to respond to those people. But on the other hand, he also wants to respond to what he would see as like sort of bad critics of capitalism who miss the point, like Proudhon as he understands him. So that these are people who, and I mean, we don't have to get into like whether he's reading Proudhon correctly. I've
It's noted when we did the episode on Proudhon, and various people in the comments said so and got very angry about it. I've got no idea about him. So,
well, I'll tell you what. I have read the Proudhon book that Marx is responding to in his like tract on Proudhon, right? So Marx's is the Poverty of Philosophy. The original Proudhon is, well, I mean, I think the full title is like, the System of Economic Contradictions or the Philosophy of Misery. And so it's like the play on words from Marx is like Proudhon's is, the Philosophy of Poverty. Marx is the Poverty of Philosophy. And
fire emojis in chat.
I've read that book, or at least I've read the parts that are easily available in English. Like I think there's like more to it that that's like that's not in the translation I saw, and so, but like the part that's easily available in English, I've read from cover to cover, and having read through it, and I actually went through this with a class, I actually feel much less confident one way or the other that I know what Proudhon is saying because. Like Proudhon kind of writes like a parody of a French philosopher. It's often very unclear, at least to me, right, how to sort of understand a lot of the arguments in that book. But in any case,
on unequal exchange in general,
yeah.
It is important when Marx starts his analysis of profit that for him it's very important to make clear that profit can't possibly come from unequal exchange. So that's unequal exchange between traders. But then, of course, because everyone is a buyer on the market, the proletarian is also reframed as a buyer in the market. And I think that's also something important that Marx doesn't want to do and why he doesn't want to talk about unequal exchange as the source of exploitation, because it transforms the proletarian from a worker into a buyer, into a consumer.
Yeah. So again, as I see it, and only reason I was bringing up Proudhon was to bracket him here because it's like I'm not trying to do Proudhon scholarship. I have no idea, right? But like, I am confident that whether or not he was correct, I'm confident about what Marx thought Proudhon was saying, right? Which is what he was responding to. That Marx wants to respond to critics of capitalism like he thinks Proudhon, who think capitalism is bad, it's unjust, it's exploitative because workers are getting like cheated in market transactions, that the law of exchange is being violated, perhaps because of sort of the force of the state being used to like tilt the scales in the direction of the capitalist, which some 19 like a lot of 19th century critics of capitalism would even sort of frame as like, oh, this is like this sort of weird holdover of feudalism, or because maybe like the money form is used to like trick workers into making unequal exchanges that they would never make if they were like being paid in like labor time notes, right? So Marx wants to push back against both apologists for capitalism who deny that there's any sort of domination or exploitation going on here, and also those critics of capitalism who he understood as saying, well, there is, but the problem is that the sort of principles of just exchange are being violated. And Marx wants to say no to all of that, right? That they have in fact, obviously he's perfectly aware that in real life, law of exchange is often violated, of course, right, in real markets, right? But it's very important to him throughout Capital. I mean, in pretty much all of the non-historical parts of Capital, he assumes for the sake of argument that everything is being exchanged at its full value, because he wants to show, look, even if the law of exchange, is being perfectly honored, right? Every commodity, very much including labor power, is being sold at its full value all the time. Even given that assumption, there's still exploitation going on, because like the thing that makes this exploitative has nothing to do with the law of exchange being violated, right?
That's like when Marx isn't like studying like concrete, especially English capitalism at the time. He's studying or talking about like a rationalized, not perfect, but semi-perfect, like laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I think that like on stuff like this, I think Roberts is great, right? Like I think he's like very clear in explaining a lot of this stuff. In general, I think that the virtues of the book include the fact that Roberts is just a very good writer with a real flair for making complex ideas sort of accessible and vivid.
I mean, the title makes you go, "Oh, I want to read that."
Yeah, sure, totally, right. And yeah, like there are big stretches of Marx's Inferno I liked a lot. The thing that like I'm spending most of the essay talking about, though, is the part of the book that I mean, there are a few things in the book I disagree with, but like the part that I sort of most importantly disagree with, right? So it's like again, lots of good stuff going on here. I think Roberts seems to have done like a ton of research on sort of 19th century like intra-left kinds of debates that again I think provide really useful context for the first couple sections of Capital in particular. But the thing that I think is most importantly wrong is his discussion of part 4, right, of Capital, right? So part 1 is commodities and money, and there's a certain kind of Marxist who's like, anytime they talk about Capital, that's like the only thing they ever talk about. It's the first 3 chapters, and then there's from part 2, right, which is from money to capital, right? It's like transitioning into talking about capitalist class structures for the analysis in part 1. Part 3 is the production of absolute surplus value. So that's like getting more surplus value from just adding extra hours to the end of the working day. And then part 4 is the production of relative surplus value. So that's getting extra surplus value from making the production process more efficient, right? So that it takes less time for workers to reproduce their substance, and you're getting more labor out of them during however many hours they are at work, right? So it which is a strategy that can be and historically often was applied at the same time as adding extra time to the working day, but certainly, especially once you run up against legal limits, becomes like even more important, because that's like the only way consistent with the law to laws restricting the working day to like squeeze more labor out of workers. And so in there, right, like he talks of, like there are different chapters on like different ways of extracting more relative surplus values. The first one is on cooperation, which is just, okay, the capitalist, in Marx's terminology, right, the capitalist relations have like conquered some branch of the economy. So people who used to be independent artisans are now proletarians, right? Like they're now, rather than maybe before they were independent artisans making their own products, and then like there's some capitalist merchant, who is a middleman, maybe, right, to bring those goods to market. And by the way, I think it's worth saying, like with your point about it's important to Marx to show that like profit can't come from unequal exchanges, right? I mean, I think like when in part 2, when Marx is talking about the ways, like, like he sort of does a couple chapters being like, hey, the cycle of, the circuit of, capitalist activity is MCM prime, right? So money to commodities to more money, but where could the prime possibly come from? It's
I
mean, mystery.
and I think you say it's a boring chapter, but I like Marx doing his like mystery journey. Like, well, it could be this, or it could be this.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there is, it's a little bit unclear in the text, but I think there is a sort of implicit admission that it's like, look, if you're, I think Marx does sometimes use the term capital in slightly different ways, right? There are times, and it's like, I think it's usually pretty clear in context which one he means, right? But like, there are times when capital specifically means sort of business that's based on the valorization of surplus that's been extracted from workers, right? That's like usually what it means in capital. But sometimes yeah, exactly, Robbie. Sometimes he uses it in a slightly broader way, right? Like, so in that chapter you're talking about, right, he refers to merchant capital and users capital, right? What we now think of as finance capital, as the antediluvian forms of capital, right? Like before the flood, right? Like, oh, the stuff that's existed forever. And I think, again, it's not explicit in the text, right? But it's like, I think his analysis would be that, in pre-capitalist societies, like, wealthy merchants, like that their wealth actually is derived from unequal exchange, right?
It's certainly like in large part, right? Like it seems, and I think that kind of draws out how kind of inefficient pre-modern capitalism, like the elements of pre-modern capitalism are, because there's like very little net profit in any unequal exchange, right? Inherently just zero.
Yeah, exactly, right. Like, because it's so, like, I think that the sort of crucial line in the mystery journey is when he's considering all the possibilities. It's like, well, maybe buyers have some general advantage over sellers, but wait a second, that would neutralize itself with the next round, right? And sellers would have whatever. None of that works, right? And then there's a moment where it's like, okay, look, obviously some people are just better at business than other people, right? Like, if we can, some individuals are more savvy businessmen, right? The art of the deal mastered, right? More than others. So sure, that could explain that, right? But he says, but the capitalist class of an entire nation can't defraud itself, right? Like, so it's like, yeah, sure. Like, some individuals can get rich off of unequal exchange, no question about it, right? But like, if the thing that we're trying to explain is the sort of continually accumulating profits of the capitalist class of an entire society, clearly something different is going on here, right? And like,
as opposed to back in the day when you made a trade so good that you just ruined all the merchants of Flanders.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I think that, again, this is like a little beyond what Marx actually says in the text, but I think the thought here is, it's like, look, sure, if we were trying to explain is like why some like 12th century, merchants made a lot of money, then fine, right? But like, the thing that we're trying to explain is like the sort of most salient feature of the society that he lives in, which is like, look at all of this like constant economic growth going on. That's like this whole system that's like propelled by profits. And if your only explanation is that like some capitalists are getting rich at the expense of other capitalists, like you haven't really explained how all of these people are like constantly accumulating these profits, right? So if you have, when he's doing the relative surplus value explanation, the idea is, like when you're starting from the position of, sure, maybe before in some branch of the economy, you mostly had like independent, like self-employed artisans who, capitalist merchant would be like a middleman to bring their goods to market, but then like the capitalists have sort of conquered this branch of the economy, and so the formerly independent artisans are reduced to the level of proletarian employees, and so now now you say, okay, well, what are the things the capitalists can do to revolutionize the production process to make it more efficient? So the first of these 3 chapters is on cooperation, which is just like, well, the first step is you can just take all these people who, maybe, used to work in their own workshops or just from their own homes and put them in the same place so they can work together, if nothing else.
Yeah, you put like all the skilled artisans in one room and make them make a carriage. But I think Marx outlines with the concept of the carriage is still enormously expensive with your like 15 skilled laborers in there.
Yeah. So, so it says, look, we're not, at this stage, like just introducing cooperation. It could be all the same people are doing the same tasks in the same way with the same tools, but like, but at least you've brought them together under the same roof to do it. So again, saves on transportation costs, and also, and also he says this thing about, how it's good for people's like animal spirits, because they like sort of, they're around other people who are doing the same thing, makes them, work more.
You mentioned the cost of reproduction for the workers also becomes lower when they don't have to manage their own shop and so on.
Yeah. And then like the second step, right? So the next chapter after that is division of labor, right? That's like, okay, you're basically, even if you're still at the same technological level that you were before, you can make the process go much faster if different people are specializing in different stages of it, right? So like I do this thing and then pass it to you and you do this thing with it, but then where it gets really interesting is in chapter 15 on factory, on machines, right? Factory machinery, where it's like, okay, the sort of best thing the capitalists can do to revolutionize the production process is to not just have people use the same tools in the same way, or even like split up using the same tools in the same way, but to introduce these machines that really
and this is fundamentally like Noah's flood.
Yeah,
this is the post-Diluvian thing.
Yeah, for sure, right. And I mean, in some ways, it's even kind of interesting to think about the fact that this doesn't come until chapter 15, because I think if you were like, I don't know, if you imagine like aliens who visited the Earth in, like the 17th century, and then they visited again in the 19th century, like the most glaringly obvious difference between the society that they'd visited before and the society they were visiting now would be the technological difference, right? I mean, like if you're just
they would struggle to see how workers were organized in between all the smog.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's like this is like, you always say, okay, what's sort of special about the society that Marx is trying to analyze as opposed to other phases of history? The most sort of obvious thing is that the technology has gotten so different. I mean, that there's a much more dramatic difference between the technology that you'd see in that 200-year jump than you would if you'd visited like the 7th century and then the 17th century, right? But I think it makes sense, right? Because of course the sort of progression in capital is explanatory, right? It's like okay, well, we need to have all this stuff in place to understand why, right? This is happening. And it's a really long chapter. It's I mean, if you like read it in like a class or a reading group, you're going to spend like a few weeks on chapter 15. And in fact, I mean, like it's a very, I don't know. I mean, probably chapter 15 is like as long as like the books I used to write for Zero Books, right? Like it definitely could be published as its own like freestanding volume. It's the Marx on Technology or whatever. And I think it's one of the most interesting ones in Capital. And I think this is where William Clare Roberts, to my mind, really goes off the rails in his analysis, because he insists that the sort of proclivity for certain techno-optimistic lines of thought that you see elsewhere in Marx is absent here, and he says there are places where you might think you see this, and he quotes the places, but like actually really if you look more carefully it's not really there, and I think he's just completely wrong about this in a really basic way, and I know this is very off brand for me. I kind of joke in the essay that I'm going to lose my analytical Marxist union card for saying it this way, right? But it seems really undialectical. That like just in a really like simple, straightforward way. Like I know that term dialectical is often used as a hand wavy way of not being very clear about what you mean, but like in a really straightforward sense of dialectical, like you're sort of that thinking dialectically means like being attuned to sharply different possibilities being present in the same phenomenon, right?
I think if we think about anthropocentric climate change, that doesn't now like kind of distangle what Marx is saying, but rather heightens the contradictions and makes us clear very, very see that coal accelerated us massively, and at the same time is now doing all this stuff to inhibit human progress.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And so it's like he kind of. So I think that Roberts is, soon of.
Me too.
I obviously couldn't write this, right? But like, it's kind of it's I would never live it down, right? But it's kind of a shame because I think the book would almost write itself. Had this idea for a long time of a like airport business book called like The Business Secrets of Karl Marx. It would be you could just imagine like the marketing copy, right? This the system's capitalism's greatest critic can teach you how to be
it's honestly shocking that isn't already a book.
Yeah, because it's like you can just imagine, right? It's the Chapter 1, MCM Prime, how to make your money make money. It's,
it would literally be like, well, you can't make profit just by being the better trader. You need to exploit your workers.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, it's you've got to like, yeah, this is.
Don't care about buy low, sell high. Buy whatever, pay low.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's what capital says, right? It's pay low, sell low. You don't want to sell high in capital. If you sell high, you don't sell.
Right. right. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I think that like you could just imagine, it's the. I mean, yeah, you have to, he'd have to be like, all right, well, yeah, Marx obviously thinks this is bad, but it's like this is just common sense. You have to like find ways to to get people to work harder. This is the most important thing to for your bottom line.
Extend the work week as far as you can.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but yeah, I think because I think it's overwhelmingly clear to me, right? Like that yes, it is true, right? Marx spends an awful lot of chapter 15 talking about all of the horrible things that happen as a result of the introduction of factory machinery under capitalism. But he not only is that consistent with thinking that the same machinery could be used for much better purposes under a better system. It's not just consistent with that. I mean, that's one of the primary themes of the chapter. I mean, he really could not be more explicit about this. That I mean, there's a footnote. He says in so many words, right? The field of application, for machinery would be entirely different under communism. But like he has, in general, like the sort of primary analytical thrust of the chapter is that it would be a mistake to attribute any of this to the innate qualities of the machinery itself, right? That the whole sort of the whole analytical thrust is to say, no, it's not the machinery, it's the property relations, right? That's the problem, right? That it's the incentives that the capitalists have because of the economic system that we have. That's the problem. I mean, he says, I mean, he goes like, even when it comes to this, like even when it comes to the single area where it is most plausible to say, oh, it's the machinery itself, right? Which is that the sort of idea that that the kind of technical necessity of like operating heavy machinery sort of forces people to like submit to a certain kind of factory discipline because you have to, people can't just sort of come and go and get stuff done, whatever, right? Like the actual yeah, exactly. Many doctors, factories don't kill people, factory owners do. Like that, that you have, but like that there's a certain sort of discipline there because the machine itself has to start and stop at given times, and you have like everybody kind of has to be doing certain tasks at certain times or it's going to be a disaster or whatever, all of which is true, right? I mean, these are the points if you've read like Engels's little essay on authority, because in that it's a very different context from Capital chapter 15, because he's making fun of anarchists, and in there Engels really like goes out of his way to be like, hey guys, I mean, if you think that we don't need to do like some sort of coordination where we like enforce, everybody doing the plan, the plan at the right time or whatever, it's like, you don't understand like, like just the technical constraints of the machinery or whatever. And Marx doesn't disagree with that, but he also describes the factory codes as a capitalist caricature of what's actually necessitated by the machinery itself, when he's making these very like Republican points about despotism and factories and all of that, and certainly when it comes to automation, which is what he spends quite a bit of chapter 15 talking about. He goes out of his way to mock the idea that like the automation just sort of falls out of like the machinery itself, right? Like he has this great passage where he's talking about Bill Sykes, the cutthroat from Oliver Twist, and he's imagining Bill Sykes being put on trial and saying,
factories don't kill people, factory owners do.
Yeah, it's you imagine, he's imagining Sykes being put on trial, and and he's like, yeah, it's true that I cut the throat of those travelers, but do you Luddites want to get rid of knives? Right? It's like, just imagine where we would be as a civilization without the knife. Like look at all the things that knives do for us. That's it's sure, so it's like what Marx is making fun of bourgeois apologists for doing in that passage is sort of saying, well, sure, it's it's sad that some people are thrown into unemployment and destitution, but it's the it's the price of technological progress, right? And that's ultimately good. And Marx is saying, no, it's not the technological progress; it's the combination of technological progress, with capitalism, right? That because a big part of his point is like, yeah, you have these opposite possibilities about how to use all this technology that under under capitalism, labor saving technology doesn't actually save labor, right? Like it's it
Yeah, like it's in capitalism, it's bad for the factory to no longer require like immense heavy lifting capacity, because then you just make a child do it.
yeah, exactly.
It's very easy to see why that would be good otherwise.
Yeah, totally, right. And
No,
it's
we don't
like,
need a certain physical body plan to do the work necessary for production.
yeah, exactly, right. Like that. So introducing these machines, um, that, yeah, given the sort of incentives that are built into capitalism and the lack of child labor laws and all of that stuff, right? Like that they have a then the capitalist uses these machines, say, oh great, all the stuff that used to be you needed to have like big burly guys operate it before, right? As the and that even imposed a certain kind of physical limit on how many hours you could have people work, because if like because their body would just be worn out, right? From like too many hours of dragging it all around. Hey, good news, right? We have these machines that it's much less exhausting to use. So, you could work much longer work days now. And oh boy, right? We don't just need to have big burly guys in it. Your wife can come in, she can get a job at the factory too. Oh, those little kids, they can come in, because now even they're strong enough to operate these machines, and I'll bet they're really cheap, right? Like that's, so it's like, yeah, like this is all awful, right? But like he's very explicit. It's like, yes, but the same technology also has the capacity of, given a different social system with different incentives built into it, of just reducing everybody's work week. That that you could, given a different system, have no loss of consumption, but just have everybody have fewer hours. That there's this great part in there where he's quoting Aristotle, saying, if every tool, when summoned or even by intelligent anticipation, could do the work that befits it, just as the creations of Daedalus moved to themselves. If you've ever read Plato's Dialogues, he loves this thing about Daedalus, who supposedly made contraptions that could move around of their own accord. So if every tool could do the work that befits it of itself, and if the weaver's shuttles could weave of himself, then there would be no need for either apprentices or the master craftsmen, or of slaves for the lords.
It's a boring point, but I read that, I was like, wow, Aristotle was very wise. It's like almost so far seeing that you're like, is that a real quote?
Yeah, I mean, it's so it's like, yeah, like Aristotle just assumed that it's like, yeah, sure, if you have like, if the shuttle could weave of its own accord without needing human labor or whatever, then great, right? Master craftsmen don't need apprentices. Masters don't need slaves, right? Because you could just get the contraption itself to do it all, right? And he quotes Antipater, a Greek poet of the time of Cicero, who says, hailed the water wheel for grinding corn as the liberator of female slaves and the restorer of the golden age. Same kind of idea as Aristotle. And he says, oh, those heathens, they understood nothing of political economy and Christianity. They did not, for example, comprehend that machinery is the surest means of lengthening the working day. They may perhaps have excused the slavery of one person as a means to the full development of another, but they lacked the specifically Christian qualities which would have enabled them to preach the slavery of the masses in order that a few crude and half-educated parvenus may become eminent spinners, extensive sausage makers, and influential shoeblack dealers, right? So, in other words, says, look, the sort of serious point he's making is the reason that Aristotle and Antipater assumed that like if we ever got really good technology, that would just like, oh good, you wouldn't have to like make people do all this manual labor anymore, is, I mean, you have to hook it up to what he says in chapter 10, where he's arguing that like under previous systems of exploitation, like feudalism, there was actually like where the surplus labor is being extracted just to sort of, just as a fund for the consumption of the, the lord and his retainers or whatever. There isn't actually some great incentive to like keep extending the workday and extend it, right? Because I mean, it's like, look, famously in the Middle Ages, people actually got a lot of days off, right? Like,
because at some point there was just nothing more to do, right? On the fields.
Yeah, and like, and if all you're trying to extract is like enough for like you and your buddies to like live high, right? Then you actually have much less of an incentive to like really ramp up the working day than if you're engaged in this competitive process of accumulation, right? That that you have to like keep trying to jack up your profits so you can beat off other businessmen in market competition. Like that's the analysis in chapter 10. So like he even talks about how the only times that you do tend to get like the feudal corvée like sort of creatively extended to the point of insanity is like when you still had these feudal structures, but they were actually hooked up to the world market. And so, there were like these hybrid cases where, the lords were still sort of using people doing their corvée duty, but they were using them to like make goods to sell in the world market, right? But it's like that. That's when you actually start to get this, what he calls that vampire-like thirst, right? For more surplus labor, right? So it's like, yeah, Aristotle and Antipater in chapter 15, they assumed that like, oh look, there's this sort of very limit, like, what are you using apprentices and slaves for? You're using it to like produce a certain lifestyle for the people who benefit from it. And so, once you've kind of gotten up to that, it's like, yeah, sure. I mean, people can be greedy or whatever, right? It's like want more stuff, but it's like, there's not like, that's really like, yeah, like kind of like once you've gotten enough to like keep those people in luxury, then you're sort of good. Right. So it's like they,
right, because they don't really like the masters, as Aristotle imagines them, aren't interested in business. They don't want to do business. Doing business is like shameful and dirty and boring and not the proper virtue. You want to go do polis stuff on the big square, and you want kind of money to accumulate to you in the background. If a machine can do that instead, then you're laughing.
Yeah, totally right. So yeah, I mean, but the point he's making when he's sort of looking back at he's at these ancient thinkers is, yeah, it's not that like it's just sort of a function of how technology would work in any context that it's used to lengthen the working day instead of shorten it, for example, right? Like this is a response to very specific incentives that are built into this one specific system, right? I mean, that's why in that footnote, right, the field of application for machinery would be, entirely different under communism. And it's even worth pointing out, right, since earlier we were talking about Saito, we were talking about soil fertility, and it's like, yeah, Marx is concerned about soil erosion, but even there, right, like he doesn't. I mean, he's, he could hardly be clearer that like he's not like, oh, so see, maybe we have to just like get by with less, right, for the sake of the soil, right? Like he, in fact, he spends the final paragraph of the chapter saying that we that what we need is a systematic restoration of that metabolic connection to the land, which originated in a merely natural and spontaneous fashion, but whose restoration now needs to be like consciously and scientifically planned to, you know,
Yeah,
in a
like
way.
if you read the couple of pages he gives on like the working class's desperate attempts to like get a bit of caffeine when they're like reboiling tea leaves over and over again, or like there's merchants who are selling them like fake tea, which doesn't have any actual caffeine content. I would really, really struggle to come to the conclusion of actually we should have less tea leaves.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. It's like again, I mean, even like if you sort of take what Marx says about soil quality as a kind of symbolic stand-in for like all concerns about environmental destruction, which is like obviously going way beyond anything you can get for the text, but whatever, hell with it. I'm happy to, right? Like if you do, then you have to follow the other half of that thought, right? Like that's the, you know, that's like, yeah, sure. So like the same way that Marx wants to, like thinks that, we need to do this sort of planned, rational, scientific restoration of the soil quality in a way that ensures both sustainability and also sufficient productivity to be, quote, adequate to the full development of the human race, unquote. Right? It's like that. The same thing should apply across the board, right? That's like, yeah, we obviously, we obviously do need to stop doing all this, carbon emission, but like not by just like, telling people,
Do
whatever.
less, bro.
Yeah, do less, bro. It's like it's like, oh, you don't, just come on, it's the, why, like, you spoiled Westerners shouldn't think that you can just eat bananas forever or whatever, right? It's like that's, rather say, yeah, you need to, you need to have, like a sort of conscious, deliberate, environmental policy that, that replaces carbon emitting with, with cleaner, forms of energy, right? Like that's, and again, I mean, the thing, to go back to the first order question, right? Not what does Marx think about this, but like what's actually correct, right? I think I would just say, like, if it was true that, the only way to end, climate change, and to sort of have a sustainable world in that sense was to just like convince everybody that, desire is the root of suffering, and they should just like, live simpler. uh I'm just not optimistic about that plan. I mean, what I would get out of that is like, well, I guess we're stuck with the consequences of climate change, because the sort of core insight, I mean, like, maybe like a level in between the like, okay, are we just concerned about the issue itself or about what Marx says about it? It's like, I think if you think about like historical materialism, right, as a set of claims about like how modes of production rise and fall over the course of history and all of that, like that's like a sort of very specific claim. But I think that the more sort of general assumption underlying that is just materialism per se, in the sense of a certain kind of prediction about human psychology that, enough people, of course, obviously people are motivated by lots of things. Human psychology is very complicated. But I think the sort of core materialist prediction is that enough people are going to be motivated sufficiently by their material interests that you could use that to ground sort of historically and politically important predictions about how they'll behave. Right? That not everybody, not all the time, but enough.
In classic philosophy of the people style, 1 minute, 1 hour, 10 in, and we haven't really said what Robert's central thesis is.
Yeah. So what Roberts says is, I'll just quote directly from the book, right? That Marx has a reputation as a modernist, not merely ambivalent about capitalism's progressive bona fides, but enthusiastic about them. But this enthusiasm does not seem to be much in evidence in Capital. And again, he goes through various. I mean, I kind of already said that, but maybe that's more explicit, right? Like that's what Roberts' thesis is. Like Roberts thinks that the sort of techno optimism that Marx has elsewhere is like absent in Capital. And Roberts kind of, again, very smart guy, trying his hardest to sort of do what he can with the materials available to him. He like very carefully parses like some passages that seem to say this to show they don't say it. And he ignores a lot of stuff that Marx says in the same chapter that we've been talking about, like the Aristotle and Antipater thing, the Bill Sykes' trial thing, the footnote about how the field of application for machinery, the same machinery will be entirely different under communism. So I think he ignores a lot of textual evidence that like is actually much clearer than the passages that he's like, trying to very carefully parse. And I also think he just ignores like, look, there are pages of chapter 15 where Marx is just kind of enthusing about the rapid progress of technology in a way that I think is very comparable in sort of tone and effect to the opening pages of the Communist Manifesto when he's like enthusing about the sort of productive gains of capitalism. And so I think the idea that like, Marx often seems like this big old modernist who's like very enthusiastic about developmental progress, but actually he's backed off of that in Capital. I just think is just not remotely true to the text. I think that again, you can argue that he's wrong, right? For the record, I will disagree with you because I think that because I think there's a certain kind of baseline materialism that I generally assume is true, right? Like it's a complicated thing to try to show that, but like I think my basic starting point is that I think that that's right. I think that enough people are enough motivated by their material interests that we can use that to ground a lot of like historically and politically important predictions about how people will act. So given that, I think like, if plan A is like just get people to get by on less, right? Just get them to accept like a lower level of development. And plan B is to find ways to, to do a green energy transition that's like sufficient to fighting off the climate threat, while still, maintaining the level of abundance and continuing to increase over time. There are all sorts of technical arguments to be had about the viability of plan B. I just think we should focus on it because I just think for sort of basic materialist reasons, plan A is dead in the water. So it's like, we kind of have to put our chips in plan B, right? It's like, man, if we accept for the sake of argument that, for whatever reasons, expanding nuclear is a bad idea, and carbon capture like is not promising, and you just kind of keep going down the list, right? If I know people have logistical arguments about all those things, but I just think, right, even if we accept for the sake of argument that like in every single one of those technical arguments, the more pessimistic side is correct.
Then we're just cooked.
Then I think we're just cooked, right? Like I think that's like, man, if you guys are right,
it's going to get very warm.
Then like we're screwed. I mean, like there's nothing for it because like plan A is just not going to happen. So I think we better like keep trying to come up with stuff, on plan B. Also, I'm not actually. I mean, I'm a layman, right? Like, don't take this with all the salt in the world, right? Like I'm just, I have no special, knowledge about this that anybody watching doesn't have, right? My sense of this is that probably the more pessimistic side of some of those arguments is not, in fact, obviously correct, right? Like I actually think that from what I can tell as a layman from looking at some of these arguments, right? Like I think that the more optimistic side is actually probably sometimes correct, but like whatever, right? Like it's not like either we'll come up with something on plan B or global climate change will just continue to play out in all the most disastrous ways. But I mean, those just are the things that might happen. And so I think that like I so my view is that degrowth socialism is just sort of deeply asinine on the merits, but like also the point of the essay isn't even that, right? Like, I'm not arguing about that in the essay. I'm just arguing it's like, look, it's fine to disagree with Marx. That's legal. Go for it, right? But I I certainly don't think Marx is right about everything all the time, right? But it's like, but so yeah, if you want to take the contrary position to the one that I just laid out on growth and ecology and all of that stuff, perfectly respectable argument to have. Happy to have that argument, but like, don't pretend that Marx is on your side of it, because he's like clearly not. There's just like there's just nothing for you there textually.
The question I had about Roberts is, so Marx thinks capitalism is progressive. And one of the key ways he thinks capitalism is progressive is because it increases the technological significance, capacity of production. And that's kind of one of the key ways he thinks capitalism is progressive. And kind of the other ways that capitalism is progressive, do have good sides to them, but are more clearly negative. Like, it's kind of very cruel how like capitalism moves people from the countryside to the city and reorganizes them in this way. Does Roberts just think that Marx? He thinks that Marx is doesn't think capitalism is as progressive as people think, or does he lean more on these other aspects? Because if he leans more on these other aspects while still thinking Marx is just as progressive about capitalism, that seems to be like more capitalist apologia than like the normal view.
Yeah, it does seem like the general vibe that I get out of that. I mean, I don't know that there's like an explicit answer to that in the Roberts discussion, but the general vibe that I got out of it is, that he's questioning whether Marx, as of Capital, thinks that capitalism is as progressive as people usually think that Marx thinks it is. I think that's the general thrust of what he's saying. Yeah, and it's also like one of the things I kind of ding him on in the essay is like, I don't understand, like there's a point where he's like, when he's explaining away these passages where Marx, does seem to be like enthusiastic about capitalism's development of the forces of production as like laying the foundations for socialism. A lot of his sort of alternate reading of those passages is to say, oh, no, he's not talking about the development of the preconditions for socialism in this like developmental sense. He just means the preconditions for socialism in the sense that it like gathers together the proletariat as the historical agent, that'll bring about socialism.
But yeah, that does seem to be saying like enclosures are based.
Yeah. Well, and it's really
which they kind of are, but I prefer the steam engine.
I mean, sure. I mean, look, I think enclosures are awful. I mean, I think the enclosures are an awful thing that like then are part of what lays the basis for the possibility of a good thing later, right? But certainly what Marx is suggesting here. But like he says, that the Marx of Capital, this is Roberts, is less interested in the novel productive capacity of technologically advanced cooperation than in the novel incapacity of individuals and small groups to produce anything, on their own, right? So, and to the extent that he's saying, and I think he's saying this, right, that well, this part of the political takeaway here is that, like, because like a lot of the people that Marx is fighting with, like the sort of, Marx setting the tone for all subsequent Marxists, spends a lot of his time fighting with other leftists, right? And so a lot of the people. So I've actually almost done reading this book right now, which is very good. It's strongly recommended. It's the Bruno Leopold Citizen Marx, which is about so the subtitle is Republicanism and the Formation of Karl Marx's Social and Political Thought. And a lot of that book covers sort of debates between Marx and people who are like these like 19th century Republicans who are not like sort of just like bourgeois Republicans, like, oh, we should have a republic, but capitalism's fine, right? But like are sort of more radical Republicans who do recognize like a lot of what's wrong, and in fact what's sort of contrary to Republican ideals about the emerging capitalist order, but whose solution to that is to say, oh, what we really need to do is to we don't like the solution to capitalism is not ending bourgeois private ownership of the means of production and like collectivizing it. It's to find ways to like universalize like petty bourgeois ownership, right? That we need to find ways of sort of having like under the republic, we'll need to find like state policies that will like preserve the like independent artisans and like give people who would otherwise just become workers, like
it is like trans historically, every group at least pays lip service to the idea that small businesses are based, apart from Marxists. Like everyone, at least ideologically or formally, from anarchists to like the far right to Republicans, Democrats, whatever, all at least make the pretense of loving small business owners.
No, that is absolutely one of the most unifying things across the political spectrum. Yeah, as you say, except for Marx, he doesn't like it, but they have but yeah, like everybody, basically all non-socialist political perspectives converge on small business is great, right? And so yeah, like a lot of these like sort of 19th century radical Republicans that Marx is fighting with, Karl Heinz and people like that, think that the solution to emerging capitalism is to basically find ways to have like state policies in the future republic that'll sort of halt its emergence and reverse it by like encouraging small scale private ownership, with various kinds of mechanisms, loans and this and that, right? So and so the reason I bring all this up is I think when Roberts is saying the thing about how in his reading Marx isn't so much interested in the novel productive capacity of that's brought about by capitalism and can be built on by socialism, but instead he's supposedly just interested in the novel productive incapacity of like individuals and small groups. And I think what Roberts is getting at there is that he's going back to this sort of like argument between Marx and these 19th century radical Republicans who want to a third way between capitalism and socialism, right? That we can just like universalize small scale, right, petty bourgeois ownership, and you say no, that's off the table now, right? And so now we need communism, right? That's what Marx means. But my problem with that is not that I disagree that that's part of what Marx means. I mean, he certainly does think that, right? But like that, I don't really see how the two issues can be separated, because look, why is it? Why would the novel productive incapacity continue to exist after the revolution if we weren't assuming that socialism will build up on at least the level of technological abundance created by capitalism, right? Because if we were just willing to in a post-revolutionary context, if we were just willing to like, get by with less, then like, look, it's not like we're in some Canticle for Leibowitz situation where this is just like lost knowledge that like we no longer know how to manufacture people using like old artisanal methods of production, right? It's like
socialism will hopefully not win through a nuclear war.
Yeah, which is, by the way, one of my I have as any regular reader of the Substack knows, I have an enormous soft spot for Slavoj Žižek, but like this is probably my biggest disagreement with him, that like I think he's very prone to this sort of line of thought that says that like some disaster will happen and we'll sort of somehow like we'll get socialism from it because like the disaster will be so bad that we'll have to do like war communism, right? He loves the war communism analogies. And
but as I often say on here, things can always get worse.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, no, I think that's, I mean, I just fundamentally disagree with that. I think that like, if we, I think that if the, I mean, look, I think if there was like, I think if like ecological catastrophe or, global thermonuclear exchange or, pick your favorite disaster, right? Like just kind of like wiped out high-tech civilization. I don't think that means that we'll, like that'll be like history sort of conveniently guiding us into a collectivized war communism future. I think we're a lot more likely to get, I don't know, war feudalism.
Yeah, and as Darsign has said here, I think any like apocalyptic view is not actually pessimistic, but instead optimistic.
Yeah.
Where you're kind of like wishing towards this sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, it's like I think I'm in a certain sense more optimistic and much less optimistic. Right. I like that. I'm more optimistic about the possibility of like abundant high-tech socialism, but I'm much less optimistic about the idea of like socialism somehow being salvaged from disaster. I think if we ever somehow had a disaster that was so bad that it meant that we didn't have capitalism anymore, whatever came about would actually be worse than capitalism, not better.
Yeah, I mean, notably, war communism wasn't communism.
Yeah, wasn't a smashing success, right? So that's
yeah. And if there was a time where the Soviet Union was close to socialism, it was many decades later.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think that the I think that, and I actually think like credit where credit's due. I don't think he had like a great plan to make it happen, right? But I think that like Khrushchev sort of had the correct insight that like
I very occasionally call myself a Khrushchevite accelerationist. Like he was just like a real productivist,
Yeah, exactly. Like I think like Khrushchev like correctly understood that if his system was somehow going to win the Cold War, then it would actually have to do a better job than capitalism of sort of
like socialism is abundance. It's other things too, but it's definitely also abundance.
Yes, yeah. Socialism has to be right. I mean, socialism. Yeah, I think socialism is abundance, or it's just not going to be right. That's so like yeah. I think Khrushchev was right about that. Again, I think that there's a if people. Do you ever read the Francis Spufford book, Red Plenty? Okay, it's a fun book. It's worth reading. It's like it's a sort of it's kind of a strange literary experiment. I really like it. It's a novel, but it's a novel about Soviet history, and it's sort of from many different points of view and different like chapters and bits of it, like in a sort of strange way. Like the main character, like sort of is the Soviet economy per se. It's like the plan, and it's and a lot of the novel is about these these sort of mid-century Soviet technocrats who like had these like ideas for reforming the system based on like early cybernetics that was supposed to deliver the red plenty of the title. And one of the and I think it's kind of ultimately, and I think the novel is like very sympathetic to these people's dreams, but I think ultimately the sort of correct conclusion is that like the way the system was set up just would never have gotten you that, right? That it wasn't that the sort of like basic way that Soviet economic planning worked, like plus this sort of cybernetic automation of like figuring out how a lot of the plan works,
yeah.
wouldn't have really worked, right? I mean, there's like a great line in it where it's, well, actually, you know what? I'm not going to spoil Red Plenty for anybody. Go read it and then read. I wrote an essay about it for Current Affairs. But yeah, I mean, I think that even though he had no good way of implementing it, right, the sort of basic Khrushchevite insight about what it would have taken to bury capitalism, is correct. So, I think I don't know. I don't know that this is like a super exciting, note to end on, but I basically think that like Marx's original view about this is still the right view.
I was going to say based on this, did I ever mention that I've been going to Chinese class for the past 9 months?
Yeah, you did mention that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm still not very good.
Yeah.
Ben, do you think you're going to be here next week?
I think there's a very good chance that I'll be here next week. I think that given the pattern lately, I'm reluctant to project too much confidence about this. But like, there's no big obvious. Right, next week is the 20th, so I know I have something on the 27th, but I actually don't think if there's like a big obvious thing that would conflict with it next week. I'm not remembering it, so I'm working on the assumption I'll be here next week.
Because today you published a book on conservative standpoint theory.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. Yeah, that's the essay today is Douglas Murray's theory of knowledge. And so for some reason, I don't really know why this is the sort of question maybe best examined on a therapist couch, but I subjected myself to all 3 hours of Douglas Murray arguing with Dave Smith in the Joe Rogan show.
I don't understand. Where's Joe Rogan in this?
Rogan is strikingly absent. He does Rogan, like there are parts of the conversation
would be 10 times as tolerable if Rogan was actually speaking.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, there are parts of the conversation where Rogan pipes up a little bit, but for the most part, he just lets Smith and Murray argue, right? So, and I mean, part of this might be that he was actually like sort of making a kind of like responsible podcaster decision that it's like
he's got no idea what the fuck he's talking about.
Yeah, so part of it that he might be that he just doesn't know enough about some of the subjects. Part of it I think might be that he's that like I think he's like pretty clearly much more on Dave Smith's side of a lot of these issues, and so like he'd like just kind of doesn't want to gang up on him too much.
Double time the guest, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And and I don't know. I mean, it's like also like there's I think that in his own aggravating way, like Murray can be a lot, right? He might have just been like, you know what, I'm just gonna let Dave talk to this guy. But yeah, it is really striking. I saw Glenn Greenwald say like he did a little video about it I watched where he said the thing which is absolutely true that Americans always like whenever they hear anything in like a posh British accent, Americans always add 20 points to the presumed IQ of the speaker.
Yeah. I'd say I need to be more RP, but probably to Americans, it sounds all the same.
It doesn't sound the same to me. I have but I don't know. I guess I've spent a fair amount of time over there. It would be interesting
Yeah.
to do an audience poll about like, you know, it's like,
How posh does Stefan sound?
yeah, can you tell the difference between Douglas Murray's accent and Stefan's accent?
Can you give a preview for what you're doing next week?
Okay, so so the essay for next week, yeah, I am 100% sure of what it's going to be because there's no way I'm going to have time this week to do anything else. So it's going to be the transcript of a talk I'm giving on Wednesday at the APA, the American Philosophical Association. I'm going to be part of a panel on public philosophy there, and so I'm just supposed to give like a 15-minute presentation for that. So it's just going to be called Politically Engaged Public Philosophy from the Left. And so since I have to write that between now and Wednesday, and
all right, it's not written.
Oh no. And there is a 0% chance that I'm going to have time this week to write anything else. That is 100% for sure what the Substack is going to be. So yeah, because I'm basically between now and then. I mean, I've been doing other stuff all weekend. There's like a big non-Substack writing deadline that I need to finish that article today. I have on Monday, I've got the show, and Tuesday I teach at Woodbury, and then I'm leaving straight from Woodbury so I can drive to my parents' place a couple hours away so I can drop off my dog with them while I'm in San Francisco. And then I am going to drive. I'm going to get right back on the road from there so I can get at least the first few hours of driving out of the way before I stop for the night. And then on Wednesday night, I'm doing this panel at the APA in San Francisco. And then on Thursday night, the reason I'm reciting all this is because you should work in the plug. On Thursday night, Jason Miles and myself are going to be doing a live podcast at the El Rio in San Francisco. Is Trump the end of history? And so that's going to be, at this place, the El Rio, at 6 p.m. This coming Thursday. I did not think to put a link to this to the description.
Is it just you and Jason, or?
Yeah, it's just us, right? So it's not like, when we've done previous live shows in LA and New York, we had a bunch of guests and different parts, there were sort of different components of different panels and games and circus elephants going on, and different.
This is going to be just the two bros on the stage chatting out.
Exactly.
Sick.
So,
bye, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.
Oh, sorry, dude.
Oh, I was going to say I did not put a ticket link in the description of the stream, but I will edit it to put in a ticket link.
Cool. Bye, everyone.
We are still